The stars outside the observation window glittered like tiny diamonds scattered across a black velvet canvas. Jason Carter leaned against the cold metal railing, his boots clinking softly on the grated floor. The outpost was quiet tonight. Too quiet. It always felt that way before something went wrong. He adjusted the strap of his rifle and glanced at the other soldiers scattered around the room. Emily Dawson sat near the corner, her fingers flying over a tablet as she reviewed patrol routes. A few others whispered to each other in low tones, their faces tense. Jason had been stationed here for 6 months now, guarding the edge of human-controlled space. The planet below them, designated PX-427, wasn't much to look at, just barren rock and endless deserts, but it was strategically important. Whoever controlled PX-427 controlled access to several nearby star systems. That made it a target, and tonight Jason couldn't shake the feeling that trouble was coming. Something's off, he muttered under his breath, turning to scan the monitors lining the walls. Static flickered across one screen, then another. "What's off?" Emily asked without looking up. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a hint of nerves beneath the surface. "I don't know," Jason replied, frowning. "Just, this place feels too quiet." Emily finally looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. "You think they're out there?" They were the Veilith, a species humanity had encountered only recently. They weren't like any alien race Earth had faced before. Their bodies were long and sinuous, covered in shimmering scales that shifted colors depending on the light. Some people said they looked like snakes walking upright, but Jason thought that description didn't do them justice. The Veilith moved. With eerie grace, their movements fluid and deliberate. And they were smart, scary smart. Every skirmish between humans and the Veilith ended badly for humanity. No one knew exactly where they came from or what they wanted, but everyone agreed on one thing. They were dangerous. Before Emily could respond, the alarms blared. Red lights flashed across the room, casting everything in an ominous glow. Jason's heart sank as shouts erupted around him. Someone yelled about unidentified ships approaching fast. Others scrambled to their stations, grabbing weapons and strapping on helmets. "Get to your posts," barked Commander Hayes, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We've got incoming." Jason grabbed his rifle and sprinted toward the main defense station. As he ran, he caught glimpses of the monitors showing the enemy fleet descending upon them. Dozens of sleek, jagged ships filled the screens, their shapes reminiscent of the creatures piloting them, long, curved, and menacing. Panic bubbled in his chest, but he forced himself to focus. Fear wouldn't help anyone right now. By the time he reached his position, the first wave of attacks had already begun. Explosions rocked the outpost, sending shockwaves rippling through the structure. Dust rained down from the ceiling as debris tumbled into the corridors. Jason ducked behind a console, firing blindly at the advancing Veilith soldiers who poured into the base. Their weapons emitted strange, high-pitched whines, and the beams they fired burned through metal like paper. "Fall back," someone shouted, nearby. Jason turned to see Emily retreating down the hallway, her face streaked with dirt and sweat. She motioned for him to follow, but before he could move, a blast knocked him off his feet. Pain shot through his side as he hit the ground. Hard. For a moment, everything went blurry. When Jason blinked back into focus, he saw a pair of glowing yellow eyes staring down at him. A Veilith soldier loomed over him, its forked tongue flicking in and out as it studied him. Its body was coiled, tightly, ready to strike. Jason tried to raise his rifle, but his arms felt heavy, sluggish. The creature hissed, a sound that sent chills down his spine, and then everything went black. When Jason woke up, his head throbbed and his mouth tasted like ash. The air smelled damp and metallic, and the faint hum of machinery vibrated through the floor beneath him. Blinking against the dim light, he realized he was no longer on the outpost. Instead, he found himself in a cramped cell, aboard what could only be a Veilith ship. Thick bars made of some kind of translucent material enclosed him, and beyond them, shadowy figures moved silently through the corridors. Across from him, Emily sat slumped against the wall, her arms wrapped around her knees. Her uniform was torn, and bruises marked her skin, but she was alive. When she noticed him stirring, she gave him a weak smile. "You're awake," she said, her voice hoarse. "Thought you might not make it." "What happened?" Jason croaked, struggling to sit up. His ribs ached with every movement and his throat felt dry. "The Valeth overwhelmed us," Emily explained. "Commander Hayes ordered a retreat, but we were too late. Most of our team is gone, dead or captured." She paused, glancing toward the door. "They've been taking prisoners one by one. I don't know where they go, but none of them come back." Jason swallowed hard, dread pooling in his stomach. "What do you mean, none of them come back?" Emily hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. "There's a dungeon below decks. People call it the Snake Dungeon. It's not just a prison. Something happens to the captives down there. Some say the Valeth use bioengineered snakes as guards, or worse, as interrogators. Whatever it is, nobody survives it." Jason felt a chill run down his spine. Before he could ask more questions, the door slid open with a hiss, and 2 Valeth soldiers entered. Their scaled bodies gleamed in the dim light and their golden eyes locked onto Jason. One of them gestured sharply, and the cell door dissolved into nothingness. "Looks like it's your turn," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Jason stood, slowly, trying to ignore the pain radiating through his body. As the Valeth soldiers led him away, he glanced back at Emily, who watched him with wide, fearful eyes. He wanted to tell her everything would be okay, but the words stuck in his throat. Deep down, he wasn't sure he believed them himself. The journey to the dungeon felt endless. The corridors twisted and turned, each step taking him deeper into the bowels of the ship. Strange noises echoed around him, hisses, clicks, and the occasional scrape of scales against metal. Finally, they arrived at a massive door that slid open to reveal a cavernous chamber. Bioluminescent veins pulsed along the walls, casting an eerie glow over the scene inside. The floor was littered with bones, and the stench of decay filled the air. Jason froze as dozens of serpentine creatures slithered toward him, their movements hypnotic and terrifying. These weren't ordinary snakes, they were huge, with razor-sharp fangs and intelligent, calculating eyes. One of them, larger than the rest, coiled around him, pinning him in place. Its forked tongue flicked inches from his face, and for a moment, Jason thought it was going to kill him. But instead of striking, the snake simply stared at him, its gaze unwavering. Then slowly, it released him and slithered away, leaving Jason standing alone in the middle of the dungeon. Confused and shaken, he collapsed against the wall, unsure whether he should feel relieved or terrified. As the hours dragged on, Jason began to notice something strange. The large snake kept returning, circling him protectively while keeping the smaller ones at bay. By morning, he was exhausted but still alive, a fact that surprised even him. And though he didn't know it yet, this encounter would change everything, for better or worse. The snake dungeon was unlike anything Jason had ever imagined. It wasn't just a pit filled with deadly creatures, it was alive, almost as if the walls themselves were watching him. The bioluminescent veins running through the stone pulsed, faintly, casting shifting shadows across the floor. Bones crunched underfoot as he shifted his weight, trying to find a comfortable position against the cold, jagged wall. His body ached from the fight and the rough handling by the Valeth soldiers, but it was the silence that unnerved him most. Even the snakes seemed to move without making a sound, their scales brushing against each other like whispers. Jason glanced at the large snake again, the one that had circled him protectively instead of attacking. Its golden eyes glinted in the dim light, and its thick, coiled body rested a few feet away, unmoving but alert. He couldn't explain why, but something about the creature felt different. It didn't act like the others. While the smaller snakes slithered around nervously, darting between the bones and occasionally hissing at Jason, this one stayed calm. It watched him, not with malice or hunger, but with what almost looked like curiosity. "Why aren't you killing me?" Jason muttered, aloud, half expecting no answer. To his surprise, the snake's head tilted slightly as if it understood his words. For a moment, he thought he might be losing his mind, Snakes didn't think. They didn't understand language. But then again, these weren't ordinary snakes. These were part of the Veilith's arsenal. Creatures engineered for war. Maybe they were smarter than he realized. Hours passed. Though time felt meaningless in the dungeon, there was no sunlight, no clock, nothing to mark the passage of minutes or hours. Jason tried not to focus on how thirsty he was, or how much his ribs still hurt. Instead, he studied the large snake, searching for any clue about its behavior. Every time one of the smaller snakes approached him, the big one would rise up, its forked tongue flicking rapidly before driving the intruder away. It was protecting him, or at least keeping the others from harming him. Why? That question gnawed at Jason more than anything else. As night fell, or what Jason assumed was night based on the dimming glow of the veins, the air grew colder. He wrapped his arms around himself, shivering despite his best efforts to stay composed. The large snake noticed his discomfort and slowly uncoiled itself. It moved closer until its massive body was pressed against his side. Startled, Jason flinched, expecting an attack. But the snake simply lay there, radiating warmth. After a moment of hesitation, Jason leaned back against it, marveling at how soft its scales felt compared to how sharp they looked. "This is insane," he whispered, closing his eyes. "I'm sitting here sharing body heat with a giant alien snake." Despite the absurdity of the situation, Jason found himself drifting off to sleep. When he woke up, the snake was still there, curled loosely around him like some bizarre guardian. For the first time since being captured, Jason allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. If this creature wasn't going to kill him, and if it could keep the others away, then maybe, just maybe, he stood a chance of surviving. Over the next few days, Jason began to notice changes within himself. At first, they were subtle. His senses seemed sharper, his reflexes quicker. He could hear the faintest rustle of scales long before the snakes appeared, and his vision adjusted easily to the dim light of the dungeon. By the third day, he realized something even stranger was happening. Whenever the large snake brushed against him accidentally, or sometimes deliberately, he experienced flashes of images in his mind. Scenes of alien landscapes, towering spires, made of crystal, and skies filled with 3 suns. Voices echoed in his thoughts, speaking in a language he didn't recognize but somehow understood. At first, Jason dismissed these visions as hallucinations brought on by exhaustion and fear. But the more they occurred, the clearer they became. One evening, while leaning against the snake, he saw a vivid image of the Veilith War Council. A group of snake-like beings gathered in a circular chamber, their voices low and urgent. They spoke of Earth, humanity, and their plans for conquest. Jason gasped, pulling away from the snake in shock. "What the hell was that?" he murmured, staring at the creature. Its golden eyes met his, and for a brief moment, Jason swore he saw understanding in them. It took him a while to process what was happening. Somehow the snake was communicating with him, not through words but through shared memories and emotions. Jason didn't know whether it was intentional or just a side effect of whatever bond was forming between them, but he couldn't deny the information was real. Each vision gave him insight into the Veilith's motivations, their fears, and their weaknesses. And each revelation made him question everything he'd been told about the enemy. Emily's warnings echoed in his mind. They killed millions. She was right. The Veilith had committed atrocities against humanity, but the images he saw painted a different picture. The Veilith weren't just conquerors. They were desperate. Their homeworld was dying, ravaged by environmental collapse and disease. They had turned to warfare not out of cruelty but out of necessity. Jason struggled to reconcile this new perspective with the horrors he'd witnessed firsthand. One afternoon, as Jason sat cross-legged on the floor, the large snake coiled beside him, he decided to test his theory. Slowly, cautiously, he reached out a hand toward the creature. It didn't recoil or strike, it simply watched him, its gaze steady. When his fingers brushed against its smooth scales, another wave of images flooded his mind. This time he saw himself through the snake's eyes. a fragile human, weak yet determined, surrounded by danger but refusing to give up. The snake's emotions bled into his consciousness: curiosity, caution, and something akin to respect. "You're not just a weapon," Jason said softly, withdrawing his hand. "Are you?" The snake responded by nudging him gently with its nose, almost like a dog seeking attention. Jason chuckled despite himself. "Guess we're stuck with each other." By the 5th day, Jason had developed a routine. He spent most of his time observing the dungeon and interacting with the large snake, whom he privately named Silas. Naming it felt strange, like giving personality to something that shouldn't have one, but it helped him cope with the isolation. Silas seemed to approve of the name, responding more readily whenever Jason called it. Their bond deepened further when Jason discovered that Silas reacted to his emotions. When he was calm, the snake remained docile and relaxed. But when anxiety or anger bubbled to the surface, Silas mirrored those feelings, becoming agitated and restless. It was as if the two of them were connected on a level neither fully understood. Jason experimented with controlling his emotions, learning to project calmness even in stressful situations. In return, Silas became increasingly protective of him, warding off the smaller snakes with greater ferocity. Despite the growing connection, Jason never forgot where he was, or why he was there. He was still a prisoner, trapped in a hostile environment with little hope of escape. The Vaylith hadn't returned since throwing him into the dungeon, leaving him to wonder if they'd forgotten about him, or if they were simply waiting for him to break. Either way, he knew he couldn't rely on anyone else to save him. If he wanted to survive, he'd have to figure out a way to get out on his own. But escaping wouldn't be easy. The dungeon was a maze of twisting tunnels and hidden passages, all guarded by the very creatures Jason now depended on for survival. Even if he managed to evade the snakes, he'd still need to navigate the ship's labyrinthine corridors and avoid detection by the Vaylith soldiers. It was a daunting task, one that would require careful planning and perfect timing. For now, though, Jason focused on staying alive. With Silas by his side, he felt stronger, both physically and mentally. The snake's presence gave him a sense of purpose, a reason to keep fighting. Whatever lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't alone anymore. Jason's days in the snake dungeon blurred together, but his resolve grew sharper with each passing hour. The connection between him and Silas had deepened to a point where it felt almost natural. He no longer flinched when the snake's massive body brushed against him, nor did he hesitate to reach out and touch its smooth scales. Every interaction brought new insights: flashes of alien landscapes, fragments of Vaylith history, and glimpses of their culture. It was overwhelming at times, but Jason forced himself to focus on what mattered most: survival. One evening, or what Jason guessed was evening, he sat cross-legged on the floor, staring at the glowing veins in the walls. The dungeon was quiet, except for the faint rustle of scales as the smaller snake slithered around nervously. Silas lay coiled beside him, its golden eyes half closed but still watchful. Jason reached out tentatively, placing his hand on the snake's side. Immediately, a wave of images flooded his mind. This time he saw something different. Blueprints of the Vaylith ship, corridors twisting like veins through the hull, and a series of glowing symbols marking key locations. "What is this?" Jason whispered, his heart racing. "Are you showing me how to escape?" Silas didn't respond directly, but its body shifted slightly, nudging him closer to the wall. Jason studied the glowing veins, realizing they weren't just decorative. They were maps. Each pulse of light corresponded to a section of the ship, and the patterns seemed to align with the images in his head. He traced the lines with his fingers, piecing together a mental map of the labyrinthine corridors above. Escape suddenly felt less impossible. But there was one problem: Emily. Jason couldn't leave her behind. She was still imprisoned somewhere nearby, waiting for her turn in the dungeon, or worse. Leaving without her wasn't an option. He turned to Silas, his brow furrowed. "Can you help me find her? Is she close by?" The snake tilted its head, as if considering the question. Then it rose up slightly, pointing its nose toward the far end of the dungeon. Jason followed its gaze, spotting a narrow tunnel partially hidden by shadows. His pulse quickened. If Emily was down that tunnel, then maybe, just maybe, he could get both of them out alive. The next morning, Jason put his plan into action. Using the knowledge shared by Silas, he memorized the layout of the tunnels leading out of the dungeon. The smaller snakes continued to slither around nervously, but Silas kept them at bay, allowing Jason to move freely within the chamber. He spent hours practicing stealth, timing his movements to coincide with the quieter moments when the smaller snakes retreated into cracks in the walls. By the time he felt ready, he knew exactly which route to take. When night fell again, or what passed for night in the dungeon, Jason approached the tunnel Silas had indicated. The snake uncoiled itself and followed silently, its massive body moving with eerie grace. Jason hesitated before stepping into the darkness. "You're coming with me?" he asked quietly. Silas responded by flicking its tongue and nudging him forward. Jason took a deep breath and stepped into the tunnel, the snake trailing close behind. The passage was narrow and damp, the air thick with the smell of decay. Bones crunched underfoot as they moved deeper into the ship, guided only by the faint glow of bioluminescent veins lining the walls. After what felt like hours, they emerged into a larger chamber. Jason froze when he saw the rows of cells lining the walls. Each one contained a prisoner, some human, others alien species Jason didn't recognize. Most were unconscious, or too weak to react. But one figure caught his eye immediately. Emily sat hunched in a corner of her cell, her face pale but alive. When she saw Jason, her eyes widened in disbelief. "Jason?" she whispered, scrambling to her feet. "How did you—" "Shh," Jason interrupted, holding a finger to his lips. He scanned the room for guards, but it appeared empty. The Valeth must have assumed no one could escape the dungeon. "We don't have much time. Can you walk?" Emily nodded, though her legs wobbled as she stood. Jason quickly examined the cell door, searching for a way to open it. The bars shimmered faintly, likely made of the same material as the ones in the dungeon. Before he could figure out how to disable them, Silas slithered forward and wrapped its body around the frame. With a low hiss, the snake released a burst of energy that dissolved the barrier. Emily stumbled out, her eyes wide as she stared at the creature. "What is that thing?" she asked, backing away instinctively. "It's okay," Jason assured her. "This is Silas. It's helping us." Emily looked skeptical but didn't argue. Time was running out, and they needed to move. Jason gestured for her to follow as he led the way back toward the tunnel. Silas brought up the rear, keeping watch for any signs of danger. As they navigated the maze-like corridors, Jason relied heavily on the mental map provided by the snake. Every turn felt like a gamble, but Silas's presence gave him confidence. They hadn't gone far when the sound of footsteps echoed ahead. Jason froze, pulling Emily into the shadows. Two Valeth soldiers rounded the corner, their scaled bodies gleaming in the dim light. They carried weapons that hummed softly, ready to strike at the slightest provocation. Jason held his breath, praying the creatures wouldn't notice them, but luck wasn't on their side. One of the soldiers paused, its forked tongue flicking rapidly as it scanned the area. Its golden eyes locked onto Jason and Emily, and it let out a sharp hiss. The other soldier raised its weapon, aiming directly at them. "Run!" Jason shouted, shoving Emily forward. They sprinted down the corridor, the Valeth soldiers hot on their heels. Blasts of energy sizzled past them, leaving scorch marks on the walls. Jason glanced over his shoulder, his heart pounding. Silas was right behind them, its massive body weaving gracefully through the narrow space. When another blast nearly struck Emily, the snake surged forward, knocking the nearest soldier off balance. The creature hissed in anger, lashing out with its tail, but Silas was faster. In a blur of motion, the snake coiled around the soldier, squeezing until the alien collapsed. The second soldier hesitated, clearly unsure how to handle the situation. Jason seized the opportunity, grabbing a shard of broken metal from the floor and hurling it at the creature. The makeshift weapon struck true, embedding itself in the soldier's shoulder. With a pained shriek, the Valith staggered backward, giving Jason and Emily enough time to slip around the corner. "This way," Jason urged, following the glowing veins toward the outer hull of the ship. According to the map in his head, they were close to an escape pod bay. If they could reach it before more soldiers arrived, they might stand a chance. As they neared their destination, however, a new obstacle appeared. A massive door blocked their path, sealed tightly with no visible controls. Jason cursed under his breath, searching for a way to open it. Silas slithered forward once again, pressing its body against the seam of the door. Another burst of energy erupted from the snake, and the barrier dissolved with a soft hiss. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" Jason muttered, grinning despite the chaos. Inside the bay, several escape pods lined the walls. Jason chose one at random, ushering Emily inside before turning to Silas. "Come on," he said, patting the floor of the pod. "We can't leave. You hear?" The snake hesitated, its golden eyes flickering uncertainly. For a moment, Jason thought it might refuse, but then it coiled its body and slid into the cramped space. The pod systems whirred to life as Jason activated the launch sequence. Outside, the sounds of approaching soldiers grew louder, but it was too late. With a jolt, the pod detached from the ship and shot into the void of space. As they drifted away from the Valith vessel, Jason allowed himself a moment of relief. Emily leaned back against the wall, her face pale but determined. Silas curled, up in the corner, its massive body filling most of the pod. Despite the cramped conditions, Jason felt a strange sense of peace. They weren't safe yet, not by a long shot, but they were alive. And for now, that was enough. The escape pod hurtled through the vast emptiness of space, its small engines humming softly as it carried Jason, Emily, and Silas away from the Valith ship. Inside, the air was tense but quiet. Jason sat on the cold metal floor, his back pressed against the curved wall of the pod. His eyes darted between the controls and the window, where the massive alien vessel grew smaller and smaller in the distance. Emily sat across from him, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. She hadn't said much since they escaped, her face pale and drawn. Silas coiled itself in the corner, its golden eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. For a while, none of them spoke. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional creak of the pod's hull as it adjusted to the vacuum outside. Jason finally broke the quiet, his voice low and steady. "We made it," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "At least, for now." Emily glanced at him, her expression wary. "For now," she echoed. "But what happens when we get back? What are we supposed to tell them about that?" She gestured toward Silas, whose massive body shifted slightly at the mention of it. Jason hesitated. He hadn't thought that far ahead. Explaining their escape would be hard enough, but explaining Silas, that was going to be nearly impossible. How could he convince anyone that this giant snake, a creature engineered by their enemies, had saved his life? Most people wouldn't believe him. They'd see Silas as a threat, something to be destroyed before it could harm anyone. "We'll figure it out," Jason said after a moment, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it himself. "Right now, we just need to focus on surviving." Emily nodded reluctantly, but her eyes lingered on Silas. There was a mix of fear and curiosity in her gaze, as if she couldn't decide whether to trust the snake or run from it. Jason didn't blame her. If he hadn't spent days bonding with Silas in the dungeon, he might feel the same way. As the hours passed, Jason began to piece together their next steps. The escape pod was equipped with basic navigation systems, allowing him to chart a course toward Earth. It wouldn't be a quick journey. Their position near PX-427 meant they were days, maybe weeks, away from friendly territory, but at least they were moving in the right direction. Emily helped monitor the systems, her training as a soldier kicking in despite her exhaustion. Together, they worked in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Silas remained still for the most part, its presence both comforting and unsettling. Every so often, Jason would catch the snake watching him, its golden eyes filled with an intelligence that seemed almost human. Occasionally, Silas would nudge him gently, as if checking to make sure he was okay. Jason found himself reaching out to touch the snake's scales without thinking, a habit that had formed during their time in the dungeon. Each contact brought new flashes of insight, images of stars, planets, and alien cities. But he tried to push those aside for now. They needed answers, not distractions. By the second day, hunger and thirst became pressing concerns. The pods' supplies were limited, a few ration packs and bottles of water, and they had to ration carefully if they wanted to last until rescue. Jason divided the food evenly, making sure Silas received nothing. He wasn't sure what the snake ate or if it even needed to eat, but offering it human food felt wrong somehow. To his relief, Silas didn't seem interested in the rations. Instead, it curled up tighter, conserving energy like some kind of living machine. Despite the challenges, the three of them settled into a fragile routine. Jason and Emily took turns sleeping, keeping watch over the pod systems and scanning for signs of danger. Silas stayed alert too, its body tensing whenever a distant object appeared on the sensors. Once, a Valith patrol ship crossed their path, forcing them to power down the pod systems to avoid detection. For hours, they floated silently in the darkness, holding their breath as the alien vessel scanned the area. When it finally moved on, Jason exhaled sharply, his hands trembling with relief. "They're still looking for us," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "They won't stop." "No," Jason agreed. "But we've got a head start, and we've got Silas." Emily frowned, glancing at the snake. "Do you really think it can help us? I mean, it's one thing to survive in the dungeon, but out here against all of them?" Jason didn't have an answer. He wanted to believe Silas could protect them, but deep down, he knew they were outnumbered and outgunned. Still, having the snake by their side gave him hope, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. On the third day, disaster struck. A warning alarm blared inside the pod, startling them awake. The navigation system displayed a red alert, debris field ahead. Jason scrambled to adjust their course, but the pod's small thrusters weren't powerful enough to maneuver quickly. Before they could react, the vessel shuddered violently as it collided with a chunk of space junk. The impact sent them tumbling, the interior lights flickering wildly. "Hold on," Jason shouted, gripping the edge of the control panel. Emily clung to the wall, her knuckles white. Silas uncoiled itself, bracing its massive body against the walls to stabilize the pod. Despite its efforts, the shaking continued, throwing them around like rag dolls. When the turbulence finally subsided, Jason checked the damage. One of the thrusters was offline and the oxygen levels were dropping rapidly. Without immediate repairs, they wouldn't last much longer. Panic bubbled in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. "We need to fix this," he said, turning to Emily. "Can you patch the thruster?" Emily nodded, though her face was pale with fear. "I'll try." While she worked on the thruster, Jason focused on stabilizing the oxygen supply. He rummaged through the emergency kit, searching for tools or spare parts that might help. Silas watched him intently, its golden eyes gleaming in the dim light. When Jason reached for a damaged circuit board, the snake nudged him gently, pointing its nose toward a hidden compartment in the wall. Confused, Jason opened it and found a cache of replacement parts, items he hadn't noticed before. "Did you know this was here?" Jason asked, staring at Silas in disbelief. The snake didn't respond directly, but its body shifted slightly as if nodding. Jason shook his head, amazed. "You've been full of surprises, haven't you?" With Silas's help, they managed to repair the pod systems just in time. The oxygen levels stabilized, and the thruster roared back to life, propelling them forward once again. Exhausted but relieved, Jason slumped against the wall, letting out a shaky laugh. "Guess we owe you one," he said, patting Silas's side. As they drifted closer to Earth, Jason's mind turned to the future. What would happen when they returned? Would anyone believe their story about the Snake Dungeon and Silas's role in their escape? More importantly, would humanity listen to what he had learned about the Valith, their desperation, their dying homeworld, their reasons for attacking? He glanced at Emily, who was staring out the window at the distant blue-green orb of Earth. "What do you think will happen when we get back?" he asked quietly. Emily sighed, her expression troubled. "I don't know. People are scared, Jason. They've seen what the Valith can do. Even if you try to explain things, they might not want to hear it." Jason nodded, understanding her point. Fear had a way of clouding judgment, especially in times of war. But he couldn't ignore what he'd seen. Not after everything Silas had shown him. If there was even a small chance of finding peace, he owed it to everyone to try. "We'll figure it out," he said firmly, more to himself than to Emily. "One step at a time." Behind him, Silas shifted, its massive body curling protectively around them. For the first time in days, Jason allowed himself to relax. Whatever lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain: they weren't alone anymore. The escape pod finally entered Earth's atmosphere, its heat shield glowing red-hot as it sliced through the sky. Inside, Jason gripped the edges of his seat, his knuckles white from tension. Emily sat beside him, her face pale but determined. Silas coiled tightly in the corner, its massive body braced against the violent shaking of re-entry. The small vessel rattled and groaned, threatening to fall apart at any moment. "Hold on," Jason shouted over the deafening roar. "We're almost there." Emily nodded, clutching the straps of her harness with both hands. Her eyes darted toward Silas, who seemed unfazed by the chaos around them. The snake's golden eyes glinted, faintly in the dim light, giving it an almost otherworldly presence. For a brief second, she wondered if they'd made a mistake bringing it back to Earth. What would people think when they saw this alien creature? Would they see it as a threat, or worse, as proof that Jason had been compromised? As the pod descended further, the shaking began to subside. The ground rushed up to meet them, and moments later they landed with a jarring thud in a remote desert area. Dust billowed around the vessel as the hatch hissed open, letting in fresh air for the first time in days. Jason stepped out cautiously, squinting against the harsh sunlight. The landscape was barren and rocky, stretching endlessly in all directions. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than being stranded in space. "We need to find help," Jason said, turning to Emily. "Stay close." Emily nodded, following him as he scanned the horizon. Silas slithered out of the pod behind them, its massive body leaving deep tracks in the sand. Jason glanced back at the snake, his expression conflicted. "You can't stay visible," he muttered. "If anyone sees you—" Before he could finish, Silas flicked its tongue and lowered its body, curling into a tight ball near the pod. Its scales shimmered slightly, blending in with the rocky terrain. Jason stared at it for a moment, amazed by how quickly it adapted. "Smart," he murmured under his breath. After hours of walking, they spotted a convoy of military vehicles approaching in the distance. Jason waved his arms frantically, catching their attention. The vehicles screeched to a halt and soldiers poured out, weapons raised. One of them, a tall man with a stern expression, stepped forward, his rifle aimed directly at Jason. "Identify yourselves," the soldier barked, his voice sharp and commanding. "It's me, Jason Carter," Jason replied quickly, holding up his hands. "I was stationed at PX-427. We were captured by the Valith, but we escaped." The soldier's eyes narrowed as he studied Jason and Emily. "And her?" "This is Emily Dawson," Jason explained. "She was with me. We managed to get away together." The soldier hesitated, clearly unsure whether to trust them. His gaze shifted to the escape pod in the distance, then to the tracks left by Silas. "What about those tracks?" he asked suspiciously. "What made them?" Jason's heart raced. He couldn't reveal the truth. Not yet. "It's debris from the crash," he lied, hoping the explanation would hold up. "We hit hard coming down." The soldier didn't look convinced, but he lowered his weapon slightly. "Get in the truck. We'll take you to base." At the military base, Jason and Emily were taken to a makeshift interrogation room. The walls were bare, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the table. A group of officers entered, led by a grizzled commander named Hayes, someone Jason vaguely recognized from his earlier days in the service. "Start talking," Commander Hayes demanded, slamming a folder onto the table. How did you survive the Vaylith? And why are you here instead of dead or captured? Jason took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. He recounted their capture, the dungeon, and their narrow escape, but he left out any mention of Silas. Instead, he focused on the layout of the Vaylith ship and the intel he'd gathered during his time as a prisoner. They're not just attacking us randomly, he explained. They're desperate. Their homeworld is dying and they're fighting for survival. Commander Hayes frowned, clearly skeptical. You expect us to believe that? After everything they've done? I know it sounds crazy, Jason admitted. But it's true. If we keep treating this like a war of extermination, we'll lose. There has to be another way. Hayes exchanged glances with the other officers, their expressions unreadable. Finally, he leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. Even if what you're saying is true, it doesn't change the facts. Millions of people are dead because of them. Do you really think humanity will forgive that? Jason opened his mouth to respond, but Emily cut him off. With respect, sir, she said firmly, we can't afford to ignore this. If the Vaylith are willing to negotiate, if there's even a chance, they deserve a hearing. The room fell silent as everyone processed her words. Hayes rubbed his temples, clearly torn between anger and logic. Fine, he said after a long pause. We'll review your report. But don't expect miracles. Later that night, Jason found himself alone in a temporary barracks, staring at the ceiling. His mind raced with questions and doubts. Would anyone believe him? Would humanity be willing to listen to reason, or would fear and hatred win out? A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Emily stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind her. Hey, she said softly. How are you holding up? I don't know, Jason admitted. I feel like I'm walking a tightrope. One wrong move and everything falls apart. Emily nodded, sitting down beside him. You did the right thing telling them about the Vaylith. Even if they don't listen now, maybe someone will someday. Jason sighed, running a hand through his hair. I just hope it's enough. There was a long pause before Emily spoke again. What about Silas? What happens to it? Jason glanced toward the window, where the desert stretched endlessly into the darkness. Somewhere out there, hidden among the rocks, Silas waited patiently. I don't know, he said honestly. But I owe it my life. I can't abandon it. Emily didn't argue. She knew how much the snake meant to him, even if she still wasn't entirely comfortable around it. Just be careful, she warned. People won't understand. Jason nodded, his resolve hardening. No matter what happened next, he wouldn't give up on Silas or on the fragile hope of peace. Days turned into weeks as Jason and Emily settled back into life on Earth. The military had placed them under strict observation, questioning them repeatedly about their escape and the information they brought back. Jason grew frustrated with the endless scrutiny, especially when it became clear that many of the officers dismissed his claims about the Vaylith's desperation. To most, the idea of negotiating with an enemy responsible for so much destruction seemed absurd. But Jason refused to give up. He spent hours reviewing the intel he'd gathered in the dungeon, piecing together maps and details about the Vaylith, homeworld. Silas had shown him glimpses of their dying planet, cracked soil, poisoned skies, and rivers reduced to dusty beds. It wasn't just a war for resources, it was a fight for survival. Jason knew humanity couldn't ignore that forever. Meanwhile, Silas remained hidden in the desert, waiting patiently for Jason's return. Every few nights, Jason slipped away from the base under the cover of darkness to check on the snake. Each visit deepened their bond. Silas would share more visions, images of the Vaylith's history, their culture, and their pain. Jason began to see them not as monsters, but as beings driven by fear and loss, much like humans during times of crisis. One evening, as Jason sat beside Silas in the cool desert air, he made a decision. I'm going to tell them everything, he said firmly, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was about to do. About you, about the Vaylith, all of it. Silas tilted its massive head, its golden eyes gleaming faintly in the moonlight. For a moment, Jason thought he saw understanding in its gaze, a silent acknowledgement of the risk he was taking. The next morning, Jason requested a meeting with Commander Hayes. When he entered the briefing room, he found not only Hayes but several high-ranking officials seated around the table. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to outright hostility, but Jason didn't let it shake him. This was his chance to make them listen. "I need to show you something," Jason began, pulling up a series of images on the screen. They were sketches he'd made based on the visions Silas had shared, maps of the Valith homeworld, diagrams of their ships, and notes about their society. "This is why they're attacking us. Their planet is dying. They don't have a choice," one of the officers scoffed. "You expect us to believe this? That they're victims too?" "Yes," Jason replied, his voice rising slightly. "They've done terrible things, I know that. But if we keep fighting without understanding why, we'll destroy ourselves along with them. There has to be another way." Hayes leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "And what exactly are you proposing?" "A ceasefire," Jason said. "A chance to talk. If we can prove we're willing to listen, maybe they'll meet us halfway." The room erupted into murmurs, some supportive, others dismissive. Hayes silenced them with a sharp gesture. "Even if we agree to this, which isn't guaranteed, how do you plan to convince them? They've shown no interest in peace." Jason hesitated, knowing the next part would be the hardest. "I think I can help with that," he said slowly. "There's someone, or something, that can act as a bridge between us." Before anyone could ask what he meant, Jason left the room and returned moments later with Silas coiled tightly behind him. Gasps filled the room as the massive snake slithered forward, its scales shimmering in the light. Several officers jumped to their feet, reaching for their weapons, but Jason held up a hand. "Wait," he shouted. "It's not here to hurt anyone. It's here to help." The tension in the room was palpable, but Silas remained calm, its golden eyes scanning the faces of the stunned audience. Jason stepped closer to the snake, placing a hand on its side. "This is Silas. It saved my life, and Emily's. Without it, we wouldn't be here." Hayes stared at the snake, his jaw clenched. "You're telling me the creature is working with you?" "Yes," Jason said firmly. "It's intelligent. It understands us, and it can communicate. Through it, I've learned things about the Valith we never knew before. Things that could change everything." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Hayes sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "If what you're saying is true, then we have a lot to consider. But bringing this thing into negotiations, that's risky." "It's also our best shot," Jason countered. "If the Valith see Silas with us, they'll know we're serious about finding common ground." Hayes exchanged glances with the other officers. Finally, he nodded reluctantly. "We'll take it under advisement, but if this goes sideways, it's on you." Weeks passed as plans were drawn up and messages sent to the Valith. To everyone's surprise, the aliens responded, not with hostility, but with cautious interest. A meeting was arranged aboard a neutral space station, far from both Earth and the Valith fleet. Jason, Emily, and Silas traveled there together, accompanied by a small delegation of human representatives. When they arrived, the atmosphere was tense. The Valith delegates, tall, sinuous beings with shimmering scales, eyed the humans warily. But when Silas emerged from the shadows, their expressions softened. One of them approached the snake, its forked tongue flicking rapidly. Silas responded in kind, the two creatures exchanging low, melodic hisses. Jason watched the exchange closely, his heart pounding. He didn't fully understand what was being said, but he trusted Silas to convey the message. After several minutes, the lead Valith delegate turned to the humans, its voice translated through a device. "Your companion speaks truthfully. We wish to hear your proposal." Relief washed over Jason as the negotiations began. Over the course of several days, both sides laid out their concerns and demands. The discussions were difficult, often heated, but progress was made. The Valith agreed to halt their attacks in exchange for access to certain resources and technology that could help stabilize their homeworld. In return, They promised to withdraw from contested territories and work toward peaceful coexistence. By the end of the summit, a fragile truce had been reached. It wasn't perfect, and there was still much work to be done, but it was a start. Back on Earth, Jason stood on a hill overlooking the desert. Silas coiled beside him. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Emily joined them, her face softening as she looked at the snake. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Jason shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "We keep trying. There's still a lot of mistrust on both sides, but at least we've opened the door." Emily nodded, glancing at Silas. "Do you think they'll ever truly trust us?" "I don't know," Jason admitted. "But as long as Silas is here, I think we have a chance." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jason rested his hand on Silas's side. The snake nudged him gently, its golden eyes glowing softly in the twilight. For the first time in a long while, Jason felt a sense of hope, not just for himself but for both species. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together.